I think the biggest myth is that it's all, just that there isn't a heavy lift anywhere, and the fact that there is, in fact, a heavy lift up front,
Yeah.
a really heavy lift up front. And then, yes, once you're past that, you can get to a stabilized, relatively passive income. And I think probably the most passive than any other asset class. That word is, I think, used all too often.
All right, friends, welcome back to Commercial Real Estate Unfiltered. I'm excited for our guest today. Ali Nasir is the managing partner of Rise360 Ventures with over 45 years of family experience in manufacturing housing communities and a track record of advising on over 2 billion in commercial assets globally. He specializes in transforming underperforming communities into high-performing, inflation-resistant assets through deep expertise in operations, valuation, and community repositioning. Ali, wait, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Caleb, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and for that intro. I'm just an average Joe, and so I hope I can live up to any expectations, but really excited about delivering to the audience with you.
Absolutely. Well, maybe give us a little bit of, you've got family background in this, about 45 years, kind of give us some background and story on kind of how that all began for you.
I'm so blessed in that sense because I try to trace the family history back, Caleb, and we go back at least 8 generations in real estate investing, commercial real estate
Wow.
investing, going back to the bartering days in India, going through migrations and partitions, it was wars basically.
Yeah.
So it's been quite a journey, but what's transferred is that knowledge of wealth, not necessarily always the liquidity or the assets, but the knowledge of wealth, right? And
Yeah,
the tenacity and the ambition and motivation.
absolutely. Well,
So
that's
those, sorry, go ahead.
no, it interests me because I'd love to hear a little bit more, whether it's offline or here if it comes up and it's relevant about kind of the family's history in India because I'm actually half Indian as well.
Oh,
So
wow.
both my family's more in the education background. So I guess one more thing we've got in common there. What part of India were they working
So
in?
my father was originally from Gujarat, India,
Yeah.
and Gujarat are known as I don't like the word caste, but India obviously has historically had a caste system. And like you mentioned, your family came from academia, and then you had certain families that were largely in politics or military or medical
Yeah.
and farming and so on. And so we were part of the merchant
Yeah.
community, I'd like to say. We
Yeah.
were always merchants, we were always investors, we were always in land and in business. And so but yeah, I've been blessed to be in the mobile home park space since July 9th, 1981. I
Okay.
was just a young man when my father first bought that park, and a typical, immigrant family or whatnot. We were all hands on. So I
Yeah.
grew up not with the football games and or prom, but I grew up right, running the park
Yeah.
after school and the weekends, and that was such a great learning experience, not just about the business, I might add, but more importantly about things like discipline and family values or morals and, and contributing to a team and that sort of thing.
That's awesome. Well, so you literally grew up inside this business. What do you think gives the kind of that street level, that street cred that you've built and that upbringing kind of give you an edge over your typical Wall Street or investment people who are wanting to get in investments?
Yes, Caleb, thank you so much for asking that. I'm notorious for thinking differently, and I don't want to make it necessarily sound like like thinking outside the box, but I don't know. I didn't know what the box was originally. I
Yeah.
just knew that my father said, "Hey, real estate's an open, it's a white canvas.
Yeah.
If you can think of creativity, if you can think of a creative way to do a deal, we can go then figure out how to structure it, how to,
Yeah.
make sure it's legally compliant and all that stuff. But first, think of the creative and the leverage way, the ways you can leverage a deal and get in. So I do want to add that so I got the street smarts at home,
Yeah.
but I wanted to make sure I understood the fundamentals as well, Caleb, and I
Hmm.
think that's important for the
Yeah.
audience to understand.
Yeah.
And so I went out and became a mobile home park appraiser. Well, a CRE appraiser, but I tried to specialize as much as I
Yeah.
could in manufactured housing communities. And so that's where I went and got the formal education,
Yeah.
I would say, aside from, university or whatnot, but that's where I really understood the fundamentals of underwriting,
Yeah.
which I think any investor really should understand.
100%. And I like that because I think there is that need for there to be that education as
Yeah.
well as that street smarts and the experience. And I think that's one thing that when I bring to clients is that, I've been an investor in commercial real estate. I've been a landlord. So I'm not just here, and we talk about this all the time on the podcast that it's not about transactions. This is a people and a relationship business.
Yes.
And you've got to show people that they can trust you, and having that experience and the education I think is huge. Well, what do you think has been one of the biggest structural shifts that you've seen in the mobile home park industry, over the last four decades or so?
Yeah, I think in the last 15 years, give or take a few, we really, I think we became recognized as an industry, as an asset class.
Yeah.
Right before that, we were trailer trash. We were slumlords,
Slumlord,
right? We
right.
were like, and the stigma of the home, the stigma of the business, the lack of support from the municipalities because it's not the highest tax revenue generating machine for them.
Yeah.
All of those things contributed to that, where we were pushed out. But then, as you saw, the other asset classes, even within CRE, not underperforming compared
Yeah.
to us, frankly, and going through some real volatility. And it's funny, Caleb. My team did an exercise recently through AI comparing all the CRE asset classes
Yeah.
and on key issues like tenant retention, operating expense budget or percentages, all the metrics in terms of ROIs or returns, cap rates,
Yeah.
ROI, NOI, whatnot. And when you look across the board, I mean, it was amazing. The mobile home park asset class, and I'm really biased, of course, but it outshined statistically, even through AI, outshined every other asset class in every measure by far.
Wow.
And and especially, to going back to your question, what the biggest change that what we saw is I think people started to recognize that.
Yeah.
And it comes with pros and cons that so many people recognized it. It helped us in a lot of ways where now you have institutional money, you
Yeah.
have private equity groups, you have angel investors wanting to get in and recognize that there's a real opportunity here. So those are all great things. The home is improved, the quality of the home is improved, the
Yeah.
stigma is being reduced,
Yeah.
the need for affordable housing is exploded, of course. So the municipalities reluctantly are coming on board more and more, right?
Yeah.
So so there's been a major shift, and of course there's some challenges that come with that. Everything's become more expensive, more competitive, and it's harder to find a deal. And so that's where being a good operator or being aligned with a good operator is
Yeah,
key.
absolutely. And I feel that about, restaurant and retail too, right? It really comes down to not the idea, but about the person who's running it. And you kind of touched on this, and my brain was kind of going there a little bit, is the issue of affordability. That is such a huge issue right now across the board. You know, have you started to see more development happening to kind of accommodate for those needs? I know obviously we've got zoning and municipalities we got to deal with. But I think also talking about the quality of the product, I think that also speaks to, the dignity of a person, right? Who wants to feel proud of where they live,
Yes.
and I think that stigma is something that should continue to go away because, I mean, I don't know if my kids are going to be able to afford when they get ready to buy a house. Where are we going to be at?
Right.
Where are things? And so I'd love to hear a little bit more of kind of that push and pull, that tension maybe that comes with being able to provide quality, affordable housing, and then also, having profits.
Yeah, so you asked, I guess it's a twofold question because you asked about development as well. So let me touch that one first and say that, frankly, development wasn't in our vocabulary in our asset class until just the last couple of years. And the primary reason for that is, there were so many communities across the country that were essentially half full. And so they weren't half full, due to lack of demand. There's always been demand for
Yeah.
affordable housing, but the barriers to get in for a resident made it very difficult. And I talk about that a lot in different places, so I won't spend a lot of time right now on it. But the barriers for that resident, essentially the upfront cost and
Yeah.
the logistics involved, kept them. So those barriers are being solved now. They're being addressed now because people are adopting a model that frankly my family's had for 45 years, and I'd like to think that we were at least a part of the pioneers establishing the model, which is to be vertically integrated in making sure that the home is available turnkey in the community, ready to go with relatively easy financing or even lower income scores or credit scores or whatnot,
Yeah.
and making that possible so that we have an absorption of 50% of half full to 65 to 85, and dare I say 100% occupancy of the communities across the existing communities
Mm.
across the nation before you get into development.
Yeah,
Uh,
fair.
and so that's what's happened in the last 10, 15 years, to your point earlier about how there's been a transition and embracing of our asset class,
Yeah.
is that absorption's happening too much, so much to the point that now people are flirting with development, right? And
Yeah.
and so it's starting to come, and you're seeing a little bit of it in Texas and maybe Florida. It's historically been cost prohibitive. And so it doesn't, I don't really know of much happening yet in California, but I have a feeling that I know people are trying to figure it
Yeah.
out and expand.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was a long-winded answer
No,
first.
that's no, it's super helpful and very informative because I think, this is an asset class that I do not have a whole lot of experience in. I've had clients that have owned and sold a couple here and there, but the background and the history that you have on this, I think, is super helpful because I think we need to be paying attention to trends, where things are going, how people are moving away from the bigger, cities to secondary markets. And
Right.
so I'm really curious to see how this asset class kind of follows suit, because to me it seems like in a secondary market it might be easier to get something like that done through the powers that be. But what is one of the first things you look at when you're kind of like auditing or testing out a mobile home park to see where its operational health is at?
Well, look, I'll look at the existing rent roll and of course the traditional things like the P&L and the rent roll and
Yep.
whatnot, the financials. But really, Caleb, for me, call me old school, call it. Yeah, I don't know if this falls in any proper category. I just need to go out to the site.
Yeah.
I need to get out there. I need to do what I call the smell test.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I need to walk the property. I need to get a vibe. I need to get a lay of the land adjacent to the property, the neighborhood even, and the city. I'm looking at basic things. Are there essentials available?
Yep.
What is the employment or what is the source of income for the residents?
Yeah.
Are there medical facilities? Are there banking facilities, grocery stores? Because if you get in a tertiary market, where you might have a great deal, even those things kind of become very, questionable.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I think,
I
and then getting a vibe on the property, obviously you're not going to walk in and talk to the managers or whatnot, but just getting a vibe
yeah.
and, looking at the property. I mean, how is it a 1 star or is it a 5 star?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I
Uh,
was actually looking to list one a few years back, and it was about a 2 hour, 2.5 hour drive from where I live. But I thought, this might be right for my client, for our client that I already know. But then you went and you did the smell test, exactly like you said. And I think it's really important because the energy around a property is important, and
yeah.
what is, yeah, again, the access to resources. Is it 45 minutes from the nearest grocery store? Well, that's something to consider,
Right,
you
right. And
know?
things come up that you wouldn't even think about. I recently did a smell test on an asset, a potential acquisition as I was driving up to one of our existing ones. And, I discovered a body of water on site
Yeah.
that wasn't really talked about much and in the property.
Yeah.
And most people would think, well, that's kind of cool. You got a lake or
Yeah.
something. But I don't. I personally don't want
Right.
the risks of a body of water that is not a man-made lake is something different. We have a community where you have full control. It's not deep and you have
Right.
full control. And you've really just made it as an amenity for your, with maybe fish and whatnot. That's very different than, let's say, a river or a larger body of water that
Yeah.
that you really don't have any control of that could
Right.
impact and create liability. So,
Yeah.
even if the numbers look great, when
Yeah.
I go do that smell test and I see something like that as an example,
Yeah.
I'm probably not going forward.
Yeah. No, and that was kind of the same thing before I took this listing on, they wanted me to kind of come up with a opinion of value. And they, just walking around, one of the buildings was burned. It was completely condemned. The one next to it was vacant. And
Mm.
it was one of those where it just was like, okay, so at that point, I have to go off of numbers only. And I'm like, this is worth half of what you think it's worth. And you had an operator who was operating it from 7 hours away, hadn't been to the property in 4 or 5 years,
You're right.
and I don't believe they even had on-site management. So it's kind of like when we talk about the operator, like if you walk into a park that is underperforming, what does it actually take to take that transition and get it from more of a distressed property to where it needs to be operating more stabilized?
Oh gosh, I think it's a lot of work. That's where the magic is, right? That's where the value add, where that's how you add value, of course.
Yeah.
And but it isn't for, the lighthearted or it's a journey. It's a real work, and you have to understand. It's not rocket science. Also, I should say that.
Right.
It's just real work. And what I mean by that, the first phase is just kind of understanding. When we acquire a property, we don't actually do anything for
Mm.
the first 90 days typically.
Yeah.
It's really just kind of sitting back and understanding. Well, I won't change systems. I won't change the point of sale, whatever, even if it's antiquated. And we won't change any of the team members. We won't do any major drastic changes for the several months. So first is just kind of identifying, assessing, because what you were told before you took over is usually very different than what you, right?
Yes.
So that's an understatement. Yeah, of course. I love how you could resonate, that it resonates with you. So first you really got to understand what you just walked into,
Yeah.
and then so that's phase one. Phase two is really kind of doing the initial cleanup, so to speak, right?
Mhm.
So any basic things that go a long way in terms of appearance, physically in the park, and then also clean up in terms of the operation.
Yeah.
Gradually kind of cleaning up, making the system more efficient, maybe streamlining it to what you're already doing
Yeah.
with other assets. So those are phases, but and then you get to real capex,
Yeah.
right? And then you after capex, which also is maybe partly in the value add strategy, and but I don't think it's the real that shouldn't be your only or exclusively your value add play.
Yep.
Then you get to your actual value add strategies that you execute if
Yeah.
there's more, one or two or whatever. And so for example, infill in mobile home parks mostly, like I talked about earlier, where they're half full. Largely, our strategy value add play is to bring in homes, to get them set up, to get them financed, to get them people in, and so our income is going up, our asset value is increasing, and so then that's phase four, right? It's not overnight.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people do think of real estate as this put money in, get money out. And I think any real good investment has that time of listening and learning what you've got. And then to figure out from there what changes need to be made. And so we've got people of all walks of life. And so, but say for a rookie investor, what is one of the most expensive operational blind spots that you could make them aware of or things to be looking for when looking to get into this asset class as an investor?
So let me start with the latter first, because things to be looking for is, of course, as you know, Caleb, you have to buy these assets right. It's all in the
Right.
buying,
It's all in
right?
the
And
buying.
valuing. Like you mentioned earlier, where you looked at an asset and you thought it was worth half of what everybody else was thinking it was worth for whatever reason. And so I think that's really important to buy it correctly. And so a mistake that a lot of newbies might make, rookies might make, is that, when you look at these P&Ls and the rent rolls or whatnot, some of these sellers are including rental income from the actual homes within their P&L, within their rent
Interesting.
roll. And that should be carved out separately, because those homes are personal property, much like your car.
Right.
And historically, traditionally, typically, they depreciate. They don't
Yep.
appreciate like real property.
Right.
And so when you start mixing those, you actually become, when you skew those, you become unbankable if you do it too much. Before you couldn't do it at all. Now they allow, I think, maybe 20% of your homes to have a mix. The agency lenders allow that on
Yeah.
larger deals. But I would say keep that entirely separate. Keep that income stream. And so when you're looking at a deal, whether it's through a broker or even an off-market listing directly, maybe somehow, if that income is mixed in and it's being included in the valuation, you're overpaying.
Yeah.
You're overpaying substantially.
Yes.
And so that's a big pitfall that a lot of people fall into, that I would say, reach out. We can talk about it more when we have time, but
Yeah.
that's something you don't want to do.
Yeah. Well, and I also think about just in this industry, people again wanting to get in, get out, get their money and run. You know, and a lot of people just think, oh, I'm into passive real estate income, and yes, you can buy into a REIT, you can buy into partnership, different things like that, and potentially get some of that. But what's the biggest misconception about passive income on this particular asset class?
I think the biggest myth is that it's all, just that there isn't a heavy lift anywhere, and the fact that there is, in fact, a heavy lift up front,
Yeah.
really heavy lift up front. And then, yes, once you're past that, you can get to a stabilized, relatively passive income. and I think probably the most passive than any other asset class. That word is, I think, used all too often.
Yeah.
That phrase,
Yeah.
passive income.
It's like it's hot button, like everybody says it.
Yeah, and I wonder how really truly passive most asset classes are. Somebody's doing something on that. You may not be as much, but
Right.
somebody, right? And so somebody's managing to some degree. But I think of all the CRE asset classes, yes, mobile home parks, manufactured housing would be the most passive. It's a heavy lift up front to get there
Yeah.
versus other asset classes, by the way, where you kind of have a maybe less of a heavy lift up front, but then you have lifting
Yeah.
throughout the whole cycle.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And the lift changes based on the markets, where the market's at and where demand is at, inventory, etc.
right.
One question that just came to my mind that is not on our topic list, but just out of curiosity, with the mobile home parks, I know that I once worked for someone who was in receiver for one of them, and this particular mobile home park, some people owned the house that was on it, some
Yes.
people leased, and so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about to our listeners about how you prefer to do those. Is it just the ground lease that you're doing, or do you have some parks that are kind of mixed?
So the conventional business model is strictly, the ground leasing.
Yeah,
And it's there for good reason. And it's also my preference. It's typically, again, keeps the valuation separate between real property and personal
yep,
property.
yep,
And then also, I'm in this asset class. One of the main, there's a ton of reasons, but one of the main reasons I'm in this asset class is I don't want to be a landlord. I
right.
don't want all the typical headaches of
Headaches.
of termites and tenants and toilets and all that stuff. And so, the beauty is you could have 100 units, 300 units, and you don't own the walls of a single one.
Yeah,
You're collecting rent on dirt.
yeah,
So I'm a big fan of the conventional model.
yeah,
That said, the challenge of the gap between the huge demand for affordable housing and that half full community that you're buying is real.
yeah,
And so you don't get to that cash flow without that heavy lift. You don't get to that cash flow without doing something to get homes in there. And
yeah,
I recommend to your operators listening or to investors who are going to get with an operator that you gotta just make sure that it's all done in a fashion that's arm's length, and so you have to have a vertically integrated infrastructure,
yeah,
right? And you want to do it in an arm's length fashion. So let me just give an example. So you have your community ownership, the real property in one entity. You have, of course, asset management and property management, but
yep,
then you also have your dealer arm,
yeah,
that's buying homes wholesale and selling them retail.
yep,
And I wouldn't be in the home dealership business on its own, but I'm in that business because I want to create the income stream for my
yeah,
asset, right? And multiple
yeah,
assets. So
yeah,
now you have a dealer entity that is agree making, having contracts with the community to place homes, to sell them and whatnot. Then, where it's possible, where it's legal, and it's a little delicate at times, that's why I want to make sure, do your own due diligence.
yeah,
But where it's possible, you also maybe have a financing arm, a retail financing arm, where
yeah,
you can provide home financing for that residence. So now you basically provide a turnkey solution.
yeah,
The homes are already there, the financing's available, they can move in quickly, and you go from that 50% occupancy and you get to 100% or
wrap
close
up.
to it quickly.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think that's really, anyway,
Yeah, no,
that's
I think that's great advice. I think that's really good advice. Well, what's one piece as we start coming to a close? What is one piece of unfiltered advice you would give to someone looking to deploy capital into this sector of the market?
That's a great question because I'm also thinking about this economy,
Yeah,
this time and environment that we're in.
yeah,
And I think so and I don't know when this is going to air, but right now, we're in the summer of 2026, right? In
yeah,
June, and the world, things are pretty crazy. So and as they can be in different phases. So I think in the midst of sex, and let's just take this time because it's a great time to consider, unlike normal environments where we're in stagflation, the Fed is trapped, and you saw this a couple of times in the past. You saw it during after the dot-com
mm,
burst. Of course, we've dealt with other down cycles like the pandemic and the '08, but you haven't seen this level of pressure on the Fed and the overall federal, system and the Fed Reserve since the dot-com burst. You saw it again before that in the '70s, and prior to that, it was during the Great Depression. So and so this environment now, I would say, and it's true in any environment, but it's especially true now to answer your question
yeah,
finally, Caleb, and
yeah,
that is that I think it's important to make sure that we're accurately identifying the value up front, that we have a good operating plan, a solid operator and an operating plan. And, you don't have to go it alone.
Right.
So, and by that, I mean, if you're not going to, there's options out there. You could invest in a REIT and earn less. You could invest maybe in a syndication like Rise360 and earn more than a REIT, or you could go it alone and earn even more, right? There's different options out there, or you could JV and whatnot. But I would say, depending on where you are in your investment life, your timeline and your goals, and how much time you want to invest in this, if you don't want to invest, years, perhaps decades to go reinvent the wheel and do it yourself, you may want to kind of pick a path in between. And so where you still get a better return than maybe an institutional investment,
Right.
and you can be a little hands-on, you can have the training wheel, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then later, once you feel better, and if you still want to go and do something, then you consider a JV or doing it on your own.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good advice. And, I'd love for people to make sure they connect with you, kind of find out how, what it is that you do, how you help people. So where can people find you online?
Thanks, Caleb. They can find us at Rise360 Ventures online, rise360ventures.com, and Rise360 Ventures on, LinkedIn. We just started a YouTube channel where we're starting
Awesome.
to post all these great interviews and whatnot like yours. And so they can go on YouTube, look us up there as well.
Awesome.
Happy to connect anytime.
Absolutely. Well, we'll make sure that our listeners have access to all of those links. And thank you so much for speaking on a topic that I knew little to nothing about. And so once again, I feel educated, and hopefully our listeners will as well. Thanks for joining us today.
Caleb, thank you very much. I
Thank you.
enjoyed it. Take care.
If today's episode gave you valuable commercial real estate insights, subscribe, rate, and share it. Connect with me and the David Commercial Real Estate team through the show notes. Remember, real estate is more than buildings. It's about building community. See you next time.